We see my title, I tried to be a bit playful. The title actually came about when Brian was visiting scholar with me in my lab at the University of BC in Vancouver earlier this year, wasn't it, Brian? I think it was earlier this year. And it was I wanted to be playful with this notion of the coming together of, in this case, different waters, different knowledge, different ideas, and how that can give us things like tides and rips and this very interesting idea of an eerie calm. And so that's my sort of general theme today, and give you a little bit of sense of that. My purpose is really, you can see here that I really want to sort of, first of all, I want you to know that my slides are purposefully set up to engage you in conversation. I really tried to bring together a string of ideas that I've been working on for several years. I even have some tucked away deep in the slide deck at the very end, some secret new ideas that I thought I'd bring by and share here. But out of the emergence of these rivers come together, what I found is very interesting in my own work is that some interesting surprises came out in my own thinking that I really wanted to share with you as well. What I wanted to highlight is that at various points in the recent history of assessment research, and I really come from psychometrics and assessment research from that point of view. I spent a while as the editor of the International Journal of Testing and ITC, APA, NCME, AERA, the European Association in Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia. And in my ventures over the last 25 years, I've sort of gotten a sense that in recent history, there hasn't been as much opportunity or interest in debate and open disagreement. And that's troubling to me, because debate and open disagreement is a type of dialogue. I remember talking with colleagues of mine who are sociolinguists, and we sort of contrast the genre, if you wish, of academic dialogue in different parts of the world. In Canada and North America, it's often pleasantries, smiles, and disagreement, but we don't always take each other on. There have been times, but less so these days. There is a genre style in the UK and France and Italy. My family's from the deep south of Italy. Io sono italiano. If you wish to ask your questions in Italian, please do. I'll respond in French. And I'm working on Mandarin, although it's not very good so far. But all of this to say that there is a bringing together, but today I have the sense that there's more of an eerie calm than there is much debate. And I actually find that troubling, and I wish to disrupt that a little bit, even this afternoon, to disrupt this eerie calm. And when I say an eerie calm, it's from my perspective, looking back 25 years at people debating and discussing validity, and also looking at validation practice, both as a reviewer and as an editor. And I get this sort of sense that there's this eerie calm, what I later call in the presentation this sort of position in which people agree to disagree. I have vastly different views with some validity theorists, and yet there's this pleasantry of agree to disagree. We're not going to really hash it out. At the same time, I have a lot of interests in common. The respondents who are engaging today, I have a great deal of interest in what they're doing and share some of their work and disagree on certain places, and yet we're this notion of everyone moves along smiling at each other, saying hello in the hallway kind of idea in the academy. And I want to disrupt that a little bit. And I think where it's most interesting to disrupt this from my point of view is to look at data production, data uses, consequences, which is a contentious issue, validity theory and validation practices. When these meet at the juncture of educational and international assessment and research, there can be some very agitated waters. And that's what I'm looking forward to, is churning up that water a little bit. This photograph, interestingly enough, of the calm waters was taken in August of 2005 by my lovely wife. And I find it a very eerie feel to that photograph. She thinks it's pleasant and positive, and I find it terrifying. I imagine Loch Ness coming up any moment now from the photograph and attacking me. Brian, there is Loch Ness, is that correct? Excellent. I can try and engage Brian through the whole presentation so he doesn't fall asleep. So let's talk a little bit about this eerie sense of calm. In terms of validation practices, I find a very interesting sort of set of findings. A year ago at Springer Press, there was a book, an edited book published by Eric Chan and I, and we looked at, there was I think 19 studies by different authors, and we did a systematic review of validation practices in different academic journals, social sciences, psychology, educational psychology, medicine, medical education, health psychology, and there was a social psychology. It was very interesting. And what became, as the papers became and the chapters came in, both Eric and I looked at each other with a very sad bit of realization that, in fact, most of what was being reported had barely changed its practice since the 1950s and 60s. What had become better and perhaps more sophisticated is the estimation methods, the types of hypotheses being tested, the machinery, for many of you in the room, the machinery is a bit more advanced. There's confirmatory hypothesis testing, likelihood methods and such. But in fact, everything else was just factor analysis, correlation with other variables. It was very sort of, and this was discipline after discipline after discipline, very little interest in things like consequences, very little mention of any, what we might call theorizing, the sort of infamous ERA, APA, NCME test standards and their various incarnations are barely ever cited in this literature. And in fact, in a few citations, including to my own work, I'm troubled at what people think that I'm saying. And perhaps even troubled every so often at what I am saying, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. But we thought the practices appeared to be rather opportunistic, ritualistic sort of behavior, almost sort of like automatons, and they mostly reported what was most easily computed. Now, just as for clarification, in this literature, we did not include large testing programs. So OECD, Pearson, ETS, et cetera, et cetera. There was none of that in here. We focused on scholarly journals in a variety of areas, including some comparisons from 1950s to the 1960s and right up to very recent work. And so the genre of validation reporting seemed to us to be very uninteresting and often disconnected. I described it once as stamp collection, but I then realized that people who do stamp gathering, in fact, are far more organized than validation practices. For the two of you that know something about this area, that funny joke will hit you on the way home. It's one of those bits when something's funny, I'll put my hand up, all of you know it, can laugh. But it was, it's not even as organized as stamp collection or baseball cards or anything like this. It seemed sort of a very opportunistic. Oh, we happen to have these variables in our study, we correlate them, and as long as they're not too correlated, we're okay. And the correlations happily stood in the area of 0.17, 0.35, if something was high as 0.4, everyone was going mad, thinking, oh my goodness, there's redundancy, not realizing, of course, that a correlation of 0.4 is hardly redundancy. But it's quite fascinating to me that the sort of practice. Now, I position myself on this review. There are actually some very positive things that come out of it. I'll let you read the book for the positive stuff. But today, for the story, the narrative for this afternoon, I really want to highlight that a lot of it was terribly uninformed by any, what I'm going to call theorizing, for the lack of a better phrase. And no real citation to anything that is in any way connected to theory. And so it reminded me of a paper by my colleague Anita Hubley and I in 1996, where we really did highlight this sort of theory practice split that still goes on to this day. There's a passionate debate among 6, 7, 8 of us. One active person is one of the respondents, Paul. And literally I could go from debate to debate and I'll see the same 6 people. I'll catch up with Paul, how are you, since the last time I saw you, and that's really about it. Mike Kane, Steve Cerisi. There's the same group of us, Greg Cizik, and then we sort of go on and meet again the next time we get together and discuss something. But that doesn't seem to contact in any way with validation practice. I will hesitate just a moment to say that large testing organizations are getting better at validation plans and validation activity. They're beginning to show some in this room, some organized efforts and connected efforts, and I'll come back to that a little bit later if you wish. So there's this sort of, in terms of theorizing, what's quite interesting is that in the 1970s, early 1970s, 1988, Lee Cronbach, Messick in 75 up to 89, even into 1990 when he passed away. His last published paper was in a volume I edited in Social Indicators Research, was Messick's last published paper. He passed away actually as we were going to print. There's a dedication to Sam in that piece. But that was really, there was not much debate afterwards. It's this sort of happiness. The current work by theorists such as Mike Kane, Greg Cizik, for example, Paul Newton, my colleague in the room, we all discuss consequences to some extent, all of them do, but I don't think they give it the centrality, particularly Kane and Cizik, of the earlier work. I don't think Kane and Cizik in particular do. Most current theorists are more muted about it, whereas other theorists earlier on consider the concern for consequences as wrongly placed and not a matter of validity at all. And in fact, Jim Popham had the now oft-quoted line that it's the right concern but the wrong concept, which I partly agree with. Contrast to that is work by theorists such as Anita Hubley and I, where we see consequences as more central. We make statements like the mere act of measuring or testing engenders consequences. And as Anita and I in 1996 and again in 2011, 2013, we try and show that even the naming of tests and subtests reflects our values and may influence how we think about or make use of constructs and data. She's an area, her specialization is cognitive development, mostly in adulthood and aging, and she talks about the measurement of depressive symptomatology. And she asks the question, and I say she because this isn't, even though it's in our jointly published work, it's her area of expertise. And she asks a very provocative question. So if we're dealing with individuals who are much older and much later in life, in their late 70s, early 80s, you begin to ask questions like, you measure depressive symptomatology, and she poses the question in this paper, should we even call it that? And calling it depression shapes how we think about it. Some of these reports, she said, are a natural consequence of life. You know, questions like, I feel alone. Well, at 92 years old, when most of the people you grew up with are no longer with you, is it unnatural to say you feel alone? No, it's a natural consequence of being there to 100 years old. May you all live that long. Mazel tov. May you all live that long. But the reality is that an unnatural response, and should we call it depression? And her point was, once we frame it as depression, then we've actually shaped the construct. We've actually shaped the construct in an important way. And so even naming things, of course we'd want to overlook the importance of consequences for theory building, future research, individual decision making, and perceptions of the use of tests in research and practice. Sorry, let me click the right way there. Did I get it? No, I'm going entirely the wrong way. Let's see if I can get this. Well, are we now going the right way? One more. There we go. So the aim really today is to invite conversation around some common themes that bring together psychometricians, statisticians, and those who come from critical policy and sociological perspective around a shared set of problems and concerns in test validity and validation. I particularly want to talk about intended, unintended, and off-label data uses. Personal and social side effects, unintended side effects of legitimate test interpretation and use, as well as the role of measurement models and frameworks in shaping our conclusions. In 2009, I made a quotation that's actually been cited a fair amount. I had the opportunity to be brave in my writing and say that it is rare that anyone measures for the sheer delight one experiences from the act itself. Instead, all measurement is, in essence, something you do so you can use the outcomes. You're beginning to see immediately that I've now positioned myself in a very consequentialist point of view. I'll even nudge you so that I hope some of you provoke a conversation a little bit later. I am, as you will see here, a moral consequentialist, and I take a particular stance on what I think of in terms of assessment and data use. I'm going to build on my line of research framed around the position that the vast majority of measures and assessments have, at their core, a purpose of personal and social change. If you wish, quality of life, which brings my program of research together. It's really around the improvement of quality of life in the most general sense and the betterment of the human condition. Yep, I believe measurement should be about the betterment of the human condition. Not everyone says that out loud, and particularly my friends at the big three-letter testing companies in the US, ETS, ACT, or whatever number of letters you wish to choose, you don't often hear this. It's about the betterment of the human condition, or at least on our best days, it's about the betterment of the human condition. If test developers and users want measures to have personal and social consequences and impact, then it's critical to consider the consequences and side effects of measurement in the validation process itself. A little bit more of the setting of the stage. I want to show you a little bit about a recent framework that we've developed. And we're really expanding on the concept of consequences as discussed by Cronbach and Messick, while also situating consequences in what we believe to be their proper place relative to other types of validity evidence. And I'm happy to share these slides with anyone after the talk. That's not a problem at all. Let me begin by making, I think, an important positional statement here. It's important to note that not all social consequences are due to sources of invalidity. For example, if a negative social consequence, such as financially penalizing schools for children's poor test performance, as ridiculous as that idea is, if you do that, if it's the result of test misuse due to external political beliefs or policies, and now I'm positioning myself, there is such a thing as an external political belief and policy, and I'll even tell you what I think that is. That's a political belief that is not my own. All right? By external, I really mean contrary to what I believe. All right? Good. A few of you caught the humor in that. Although in the end, I think that it partly is that. It partly is that. Then such a consequence is really outside of the realm of validity. So misuse is outside of the realm of validity in our position. If social consequences occur that are traceable to construct underrepresentation and or construct irrelevant variance, then the construct and or measure need to be modified to incorporate these findings. If they're not, then they're not part of validity. And that's really a position that Sam Messick most explicitly stated later in his life. Anita Hubley and I presented a framework for test validation that expands on this concept a great deal. It's a very busy looking diagram, but please allow me just a few moments to say a bit about it. This is a framework that we presented in 2013 in the chapter in the American Psychological Association, the Handbook of Psychological Assessment. I think it was a 3-volume piece. They asked us to do the unthinkable, which is to review the field. Everything from development to use and validation of mathematical models, everything. Anita Hubley and I were divorced before that happened. That's actually true. Anita's my ex-wife. And we still write together to this day, rather amicably. Periodically lawyers are called, but that's a separate matter. No, that was fun. Good, 2 of you laughed. And she'll see the video and not find that funny, so off we go. So here's our framework that we came about with after much going to and fro. And we have another framework that we've talked about, sort of evolving framework. You see a couple of key things that are important in all of this. You look at theory and theories, and these theory and theories are not just the theory of the construct and of the phenomena, but psychometric theory, how you think of and see measurement. There is more than one view. Unbeknownst to some in the world, there is more than one mathematical model of measurement. And they, at times, are quite distinct and make very different claims about the data. Should surprise no one with mathematical training. Of course they would. So theories and theories of measurement. You'll see values along your right, if I remember correctly. You'll see values coming to and fro. So we'll take sort of a contemporary philosophic position on the importance of values throughout. You see how there's a movement to and fro, construct, test development, test validation, and explanation, score use reporting, and then you see consequences and side effects. But then you also see back looping throughout. My own position in terms of test validity is one in the sense that validity is about explanation of the test variation and validation is the practice by which we go through and find that explanation. So I'm very much an explanation-focused person. I'm not the only one. That probably Cronbach and Meehl were the traditional ones in the 1950s, in that 1950s form of philosophy of science. And then others have taken up the cause, myself and Denny Boersboom, who have slightly different views about it. But these are all really explanation-focused views. So you see explanation and validation in there, but you also see consequences and side effects. I want to unpack that third box from the bottom, the test validation and explanation box, just a little bit in my next slide. Oh, there we go. So we want to unpack that box, and it's kind of like one of those sort of Russian doll things. There's even more inside it. Inside it, you take a look at the core of it being test meaning and inference, and then all this kind of evidence shaping and informing test meaning and inference. It's also important to note that the arrows from the various forms of evidence and the intended social and personal consequences, unintended social and personal side effects, and test score meaning, all of these are bidirectional. So you now see inside here unintended social and personal side effects. This implies, for example, that unintended social and personal side effects can impact test score meaning and inference, and vice versa. Just a little bit more about this. Intended consequences and unintended side effects of legitimate test use appear both as a separate stage in the measurement and assessment framework in Figure 1 and as validity evidence in Figure 2. This is done to highlight that these consequences and side effects occur naturally as a result of reporting using tests, but also have an impact on test score meaning and validity. We actually make the claim that there's actually a bidirectional relationship here. It's bidirectional. And you can see that we have that orange slide, and you can see it being unpacked to the right in Figure 2, but you can also see in blue consequences in there as well. I'm not troubled by something being multi-layered. I'm not troubled at all by it. I admit it does add complexity, but that's fine. I think we're okay with that. At least I am. So let me take a little bit of a test run, as you wish. This is actually an example that Mike Kane has been encouraging us to think through. And so in actually, one person who's engaged us a great deal in this area has been Mike Kane offline via personally and over email and such. And he said, listen, Bruno, and take this case of a high school math placement test, a math placement test. In high school, to place students in advanced courses, functions and relations, pre-calculus, calculus. Consider a potential intended consequence of determining which mathematics class would best serve a student's educational needs, and B, a potential unintended side effect of the exclusion of girls, young women, from technical careers requiring advanced school math courses. He said, take a look at, contrast these two ideas. Going back and forth, this is how we shape the problem down. Very provocative question. And in fact, one that many who do work in math assessment will face rather regularly. This, we believe, is a regular part to it. So the first element is a potential intended consequence of determining which mathematics classes would best serve a student's educational needs, and be a potential unintended side effect of the exclusion of girls from technical careers requiring advanced school mathematics, STEM careers as they're sometimes called. How each of the above social consequences and side effects of use affect the meaning of mathematics scores, how mathematics knowledge is conceptualized and operationalized, and theories about mathematical reasoning, gender, and cognitive development all need to come together to address this issue. Yes, even the complicated social construct of gender needs to come, as well as the complicated social construct of cognitive development and mathematical reasoning. Explicit consideration of social and personal consequences and side effects might enlighten us with respect to whether personal, for example, age, gender, culture, I say that the word culture hesitantly with my anthropologist friends in the room, but let's use the word for now. Age, gender, culture, and contextual factors, learning, environment, social support, gender socialization, they're part of the mathematics construct, or are they external to it? That's a question we need to have an explicit consideration. Are things like gender, learning environment, age, socialization, social support, are they part of the construct, or are they external to it? That is a fundamental question that needs to be addressed in this consideration. When the social consequences and side effects of using a mathematics placement test are not congruent with our societal values and goals regarding gender-based educational and occupational opportunities, such insights might be used to modify aspects of the mathematics construct, theories and aspects of the test development until there's a desired congruence among values, purpose, and consequences come together. So what we're saying is when you see this incongruence, it should push you to go back and think about the construct and how you wish to use the construct and how society wishes that you use the construct. Look what I've done. I've now opened this up, and we've opened this up to a social dialogue. As a sidebar, as a mathematician and psychometrician, that's absolutely terrifying. Years ago, my friend Harvey Goldstein said that it was the most disquieting moment in a psychometrician's life when they realized that all the equations on the chalkboard now have to be discussed in some sense in a social venue is absolutely terrifying. Why? Because I prefer to chat with like-minded mathematicians in our scroll and dialogue and internal logic. All of a sudden, I need to make cases like, well, you know, all items are equally discriminating. And you're like, really? Society's going to believe that? A group of very interesting mathematicians do, and statisticians do, in case you're wondering, these are the Rochists, the devout Rochists. I don't mean the practical Rochists. I mean the religious, spiritual Rochists. And some of whom are my close friends, I might add. But I also hang out with Catholics and Presbyterians and others as well. And algebraists. We're all a bit of a spiritual group. But what's interesting is you now have to bring that forward and say, well, actually, we're going to believe this and negotiate it within a broader venue. That's terrifying to a psychometrician and mathematician, at least to me. How does that sound? Well, let's go back. Depending on the outcome of the above analysis, it's tempting to argue that the proposed use of the high school test to place students in advanced courses is inappropriate because of the social consequences and side effects. This would then suggest that the main thrust of analysis of consequences is to evaluate the appropriateness of the various uses of a test. But I would argue that this approach is wrong-headed. We need to go one step further. Certainly, consequences and side effects can impact test use. There's no doubt about it. However, in the context of validity and validation, by declaring the proposed use as inappropriate, one has moved the proposed use from a legitimate test use to test misuse, which then makes it no longer relevant to validity and validation. So there's an interesting rhetorical shift that happens when people move that. Indeed, it might be appropriate to discuss alternative paths for girls to obtain high school math courses, prepare them for technical careers, but not necessarily useful to decide that the proposed course, test use, is inappropriate. So there are other ways of thinking about this. Instead, when considering validity, one really needs to ask if and how a side effect of excluding girls from technical careers requiring advanced high school math courses impacts our conceptualization of constructs of mathematics knowledge, the development of test items, and our understanding of related theories about mathematics knowledge, gender, and development. One begins to wonder if how we test mathematics, in fact, is implicitly gendered. And I would argue it is. And that's what we would argue. I would argue it is. And I might add, of my last 20 PhD students, 17 happen to be self-identify as female, which is and all doing very mathematical work. And so this whole notion that how we assess mathematics may in fact be assessing gender. in this very interesting, complicated way. We argue that our framework provides a much-needed systematic approach to the analysis of consequences by differentiating the various types of consequences and where and when they play a role. Provide a method for investigating it, and our new model of validity and validation highlights some key features. I can't do justice to the model today. We actually have a manuscript, one in 2011 and another one that we've been knocking about for a while. We'll be looking for a home for it in a bit, where we actually unpack this a bit more. We really try and take this apart a bit more. A couple more slides on this and then we're going to move on. How am I doing for time?
You have another 10 minutes.
Perfect. Sounds great. First, one can envision that based on a construct, one develops a test or measure to develop one ascribes, which one ascribes test score, meaning, inference. From test score, meaning, inference emerge intended social and personal consequences, but also unintended social and personal side effects of legitimate test use. Unlike Messick, we argue there may be personal as well as social impacts. In addition, we think it's helpful to use different terms to distinguish between intended consequences and unintended side effects. Importantly, consequences and side effects of legitimate test use may also influence test score meaning and inference, which makes them relevant to the validation. I love how Laurie Shepard in '97 put it together. Consequences are evaluated in terms of the intended construct meaning, and I think that really brings it together nicely. Once an intended consequence or unintended side effect of legitimate test use have been identified, one then needs to explore what that consequence or side effect might mean for score meaning. And yes, that means sitting and thinking and providing evidence and an evidential trail for your reasoning. Although we do not discuss it in this presentation, in our paper we show how our framework is flexible enough to consider tests that are administered and used for individual or large-scale testing programs, what Barry Four and I call multi-level measures and multi-level validation, which is actually a slightly different talk. But all of these issues apply whether you're dealing with multi-level validation. For example, let's imagine a testing program in which we sort countries in terms of test scores. I know it's hard for us as a group to imagine that, but good, two of you smiled. These are multi-level. What's remarkable is that the validity evidence, when it is reported, is often at the individual level and not matched at the level of inference. And Barry Four and I talk about that mismatch in that sort of idea. We're not the first. Bob Lynn also got into this issue about a decade ago as well. So now let me make a switch around, this sort of tide and confluence and such. In getting here, it dawned on me that I wanted to bring forward a new idea, one that I'm not used to seeing in our field. And I'd be curious to see if anyone else can give me citations in which people have talked about this in this language. I want to talk about now what I'm going to call off-label use of a test or an assessment. And what is off-label use of a test or assessment? Let me give you my first cut at a definition. Off-label use is the use of a test or measurement for an unapproved purpose or for an undocumented or unapproved intended target test group, such as an age group or a cultural group. Off-label may also include test administration in an unapproved or undocumented manner. Generally, I would caution against off-label use, but there is some subtlety to this. And yes, I am purposefully borrowing language from this sort of pharmaceutical notion, although measurement is not pharmacy by any stretch. Well, we'll come back to that. But there is some interesting notion of this notion of off-label use. One of the things that appears immediately to be a subtle problem is that there's not a great deal of discussion of off-label use, partly because many but not all test developers, they don't necessarily want us to dictate, they don't want to dictate the use of a test, or more specifically, what should not be used for, or for whom the test should not be administered. Most test developers, and even purveyors of data, test data, don't necessarily want to tell you what it should be used for. That in itself is troubling to me. And even further, they don't want to tell you what they shouldn't be used for. So a hypothetical testing program might say, please don't use our testing program, our test scores to rank schools. Please do not use our test scores to penalize teachers. We don't say these things. Testing programs don't say these things. There's a variety of reasons why. Part of it is purely economic, but part of it is they don't want to restrict the use. I'm going to challenge and say, well, that makes things like off-label use to be rather problematic when there isn't a label, right? It really becomes a very puzzling idea. How do I know that something's being misused if I don't know for what is supposed to be used or for what it's supposed to not be used? So we'll have debates like test scores in education should not be used to finance education. I agree. Where does any test developer tell me that? None that I've ever met. None that I've ever met. Why wouldn't they do that? Well, on my most cynical day, one says, well, the reason you don't do it is you don't want to tell people what you should use a product for. Why? Well, as my marketing and management people would say, well, that limits your market. I'm like, well, I don't want to limit. I want to limit the market. I want to challenge us with this notion of off-label use to maybe limit the market. So it's hard to determine off-label use sometimes because they don't tell us what's on-label. It's not nearly impossible, it is nearly impossible to police off-label use, even when we do have some restrictions. And so I think it goes on quite often. And there is this sort of shared notion of what's off-label, because there's a shared notion, negotiated notion of what's on label but never documented. Test users may use an off-label test. And here's where I try and make a subtle twist. I generally do not recommend off-label use. But there's a subtlety. They may use a test off-label, however, off-label use must better serve, in our case, the student, or more generally the test taker, or data usage more generally. And it has to serve it better than other alternatives, such as no test information or a test that is already known to be inappropriate. And I even borrow ideas here from statistical information theory when there is such a thing as bad information, or misinformation as we call it. And misinformation guides you in the wrong direction.
Bruno, you now have 5 minutes.
Wonderful. I only have 1 or 2 slides left. In addition, the off-label use must be supported, and here's the catch, it must be supported by evidence or experience to support the lack of unintended negative consequences and efficacy in construct interpretation. So if you're going to be daring and use something, a test or data, for use that it was not originally intended, you then have a responsibility to support it by evidence or experience and support the lack of unintended negative consequences and the efficacy in construct interpretation. Caution that, as described in our model, off-label use may alter the construct and or lead to unintended social and personal consequences, but also unintended social and personal side effects of off-label use. A couple slides and then we're going to wrap it up from my side and then engage in the conversation that I hope will be stirred by all of this. In the conclusion, I have a little bullet that says the role of consequences in validity and validation was, in recent history, a topic of great controversy and discussion in the measurement field. Currently, my feeling is that there's a let's just agree to disagree. In fact, Paul organized, I think, Paul, you were the organizer of that NCME symposium a few years ago in Philadelphia. And I was in the audience and I stood up at the end and I said, hey, no one's really talking about consequences. And one of my dear friends from the podium said, yeah, it's because we don't want to debate it. Or something like this. Or because we all agree that it's not something we want to talk about. And I thought, well, that was troubling to me. That was very troubling to me. And I wanted to storm the podium. But then everyone left. So much of the discussion against the inclusion of consequences in validation has focused on test misuse, which I think is wrong-headed, and B, concerns about the feasibility and the burden of incorporating consequences as an expected element of the validation process. My dear friends at testing organizations and data organizations say, Bruno, this is far too great a burden. Well, in our new framework, we correct some of the misconceptions about consequences, expand our understanding of this concept, and situate consequences and side effects in such a way that incorporating them becomes more feasible and less daunting, but it's still work. It's still work. Like Messick, in 98 in particular, we do not view test misuse as an aspect of social consequences in the context of validation. While test misuse is an important concern, it's irrelevant to discussions of score meaning and thus outside of the construct of validity in the validation process. Instead, it is the consequences of legitimate data use and test use that may influence test score meaning and inference and what makes consequences relevant to the validation process. That, to us, is really where it plays. We presented our new framework of a unified view and more clearly articulates social consequences, and I do hope you track it down. I really do. To be able to examine the values implicit in and the social and personal consequences and side effects stemming from legitimate test interpretation and use requires that test developers and test users be willing to think deeply about validity and not just be automatons in the validation process. To truly move our understanding of the meaning of test scores forward, we must be willing to do the work to examine what all of the available validity evidence tells us. Thank you very much. And some of you asked what Paragon was. It's actually, it's a terrible, this is my endowed professorship that was given recently, and my dear friends they all play on the word Paragon. Actually, it's even more sad than you think. It's actually the name of a testing organization that's endowed my professorship, and the testing organization is a wholly owned subsidiary of my university. Much like, I think Cambridge tests are owned by Cambridge, UBC has a little tiny thing called Paragon with a very loud professor who they've endowed as their chair. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.